Welcome to This Week in Impact, where we bring you some of the most interesting impact investing and sustainable finance stories of the week. It's Thursday, November 7th. I'm Brian Walsh, and I'm joined this week by Impact Alpha's editor, David Bank. We'll discuss the initial reactions from agents of impact to President Trump's re-election, an update on some of the funding already being distributed from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that was part of President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, and how a mutual aid network in Asheville, North Carolina is helping overlooked entrepreneurs rebuild after Hurricane Helene. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, David. How are you doing this week?
Well, it's been quite a week, Brian. I'm not quite sure how I'm doing yet.
Well, like many of us, you're in the processing phase of this week's big news.
Yeah, well, as a journalist, we always want to live in interesting times, and I think that wish will be fulfilled.
Interesting times indeed. Well, last week in the podcast, you noted that at the recent SOCAP conference, the presidential election hadn't been top of mind for impact investors. Well, now that President Trump has won a decisive popular vote and electoral college victory, investors and agents of impact around the world are starting to process the implications of a second Trump term. You and the Impact Alpha team spoke yesterday to lots of sources to take their temperature. What did you learn?
Well, I think in the last week we said we were kind of running in air and hadn't quite looked down like a cartoon character, and I guess folks now have peered down into the abyss, as it were. We found out, and we talked to a couple dozen folks just to kind of take the temperature. I would say that some of the people wanted to put their comments, off the record. They didn't want to sound defeatist or angry in any way, certainly for public consumption. But I would say even authentically, we're already pivoting to sort of what can be done, what needs to be done, where does the work go, and also some humility and reflection about why the voting kind of went the way it did. And I would say the most interesting part on that front was a kind of notion that the grievance, as it were, or the dislocation that many folks feel economically about, and a sort of perception of a rigged economy, some of those impulses are exactly what motivate a lot of impact investors. That the access to capital, that access to prosperity has been pretty much unequal and unjust in many ways. And so many of the solutions and initiatives of the impact investing world actually, are at some level attempts to address that kind of anger and that kind of resentment. And so, there's certainly a question about how that has been communicated over time, the language, the perceived, elitism, the perceived, maybe interest group politics that sometimes comes into play. But there's also an opportunity that folks were starting to wake up to yesterday that there's now an appetite and an appreciation of those kinds of wealth building, shared prosperity kind of initiatives, because that seems to be what folks are hungering for.
And so it's that notion of leaning into the economic populism, because those are the messages that seem to be resonating.
Yeah, populism has always had, two aspects. One has been a kind of self-righteous kind of, thumbing of noses and uprising against kind of elites. And those can be corporate elites, banking elites, as well as cultural elites. The other part has been over, historically and possibly even now, has a kind of xenophobic or nativist, nationalist kind of quality as well. But those two things don't necessarily have to go together, and there could be a notion that bringing more of the pie down to more of the people is a shared aspiration on sort of both the quote left and the quote right, and there may be some common cause to be made.
Right. I think one of the things that Trump has successfully done over his career, especially in politics, is kind of articulated and popularized a notion of a zero-sum mentality, that it's an us versus them, and we just got to get to get the biggest slice of the pie that you can for yourself. And I think that resonates with some of his voters, this idea that he's rich and he's going to help us become rich as well.
Yeah, but I think there's a fallacy in there, which is that it's not really zero sum. I mean, economic growth really, is an expanding pie, and the question really is the distribution of that pie. But I think what the owners, we've called it the ownership economy. I think the insight there is that you're not sort of redistributing on the back end only, in terms of taxes or what have you, or transfer payments, but you're actually pre-distributing, as people say, and helping folks get a stake in those kinds of assets, whether they're, homes or businesses or stakes in businesses in the case of employee ownership, that appreciate over time, and everybody does get rich together. And again, that's something that has a lot of, bipartisan appeal. It's very much, a sort of up by your bootstraps and self-help sort of notion that appeals to kind of deep roots of American culture, but it also can redistribute or pre-distribute the wealth and cut more people in to the system. So there's again places where the agendas certainly could overlap, and as this conversation, particularly if the Republicans aspire to be the party of the working class, then the working class should make sure that its interests really are represented. And as everybody grapples with those questions, I think some of the solutions that sort of the ownership economy and other folks in the impact world have been putting forward may get a second look.
Now, moving from the, if you will, working class or education gap between the parties, there's also the big gender gap. And what are people in the impact investing community saying about, the importance of gender issues and women's leadership, now that Trump has defeated his second female opponent?
Yeah, I mean, again, that was some of the sort of little off the record, teeth gnashing. I just want to point out, there is no really such thing as the impact investing community, and there are folks in all across the ideological spectrum, all across the geographies, in red states, blue states, other countries obviously as well. So we didn't try to sort of, characterize necessarily, everybody, but I will say that, probably just, sort of on the face of it, that folks were by and large, disappointed with the election results, at least the folks we were speaking to. And part of it was, as you said, there was this historic chance to elevate women's leadership yet again, and yet again, it didn't quite happen. I think that again, there's a sort of backlash to the backlash, or just counter programming in a sense. So I think women's issues, the women's vote, obviously was very central to Kamala's support, and so I think that as a investment theme and as a leadership sort of development project, women are going to be as central, if not more central than ever, in most of the strategies going forward. And so we spoke with Sana Kapadia at Heading for Change, and she said that it feels like a moment, that November 5th will be some kind of turning point. She said, I'd like to believe that when we remember this day, that we can make it happen, that and there's enough of us who care about making the world better for everybody. So some kind of, again, resolute determination to press forward.
And speaking of pressing forward, what has been some of the feedback around climate and kind of clean technologies and renewable energies in the space in the face of a Trump term?
Well, that's kind of one of the most interesting areas because, there's, I think, a general perception that Trump has not been sympathetic to climate action, pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accords his last time around, and he's, scorned, EVs, even though he has Elon Musk as his right-hand man now. But on the other hand, it's kind of going to be hard to see how they'll really unwind some of the investments, particularly out of the Inflation Reduction Act, which we got some numbers in yesterday for our story. There's been something like 330 clean energy and sort of EV projects announced since the IRA went into effect about 2 years ago. And that's something more than 100,000 jobs and something more than $125 billion in private investments spurred by that bill, and a whopping 60% of the projects and 85% of the money and almost 70% of the jobs are in Republican congressional districts. So I think that was not by accident, and part of that was to kind of future-proof or politics-proof some of that investment. So, and there have been already, Republican Congress people telling Speaker Mike Johnson, don't mess with those jobs in our districts. So there's kind of a part of the, maybe wishful thinking, but part of the thinking is that the clean energy economy has now got a head of steam that is going to be impossible to reverse. And so we'll see about that.
Well, speaking of building those kind of coalitions and bipartisanship, what are impact investors that you and the team spoke to talking about the political resiliency that needs to be built here?
Well, I think it's interesting. There has been a kind of underground, I guess, effort in the past year or so to build those kind of bridges, just in case, contingency plans, I suppose. And so a lot of the advocacy groups and climate groups, as you mentioned, have now made good outreach into Republican congressional offices and other places. And so, there's going to have to be by force a kind of accommodation, and I think that folks will find that again that they might have more to talk about than they thought once you can sort of put aside the particulars of the election and the division that causes. If folks really do want to get stuff done, there's only so many things to be done that actually work, and so that's kind of again possibly grasping at straws, but also sort of facing down the new reality.
All right. Well, more to come as people still continue to process the results of this presidential election and anticipate what's going to happen under a second Trump presidency. But let's take a quick break for now. And when we come back, an update on the National Clean Investment Fund's $14 billion in funding as part of Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. David, let's talk green financing in the U.S. To start, we must first provide the jargony context for the U.S. federal government's efforts to provide money to accelerate climate investing. So under President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, they set up the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or GGRF, that then established the National Clean Investment Fund, or NCIF, which awarded $14 billion in grants to 3 networks of organizations, including the Coalition for Green Capital, or CGC. So far, so good? All right. Our Amy Cortese spoke with Reed Hundt, the outgoing leader of the CGC, or Coalition for Green Capital, to get an update on some of the early deals from his network, which received about $5 billion in federal funding. So, David, what are we learning from that initial effort?
Well, this is the point of the spear of the Inflation Reduction Act, the GGRF, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. We've been following it closely because it not only provides money to lend out for green infrastructure projects, for community projects. It particularly is focused on low-income communities as part of, and there's a Justice 40% of it should go to disadvantaged communities under the Biden policy, and as a result of that, it's also a major infusion of cash for a whole network of community lenders or community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, as you say, and so it expands kind of the infrastructure for lending as well as particular financing for green projects. So that has been a long time in planning, a long time in selecting the recipients, as you said. Then that was done over the summer. Now, since then, they've been busily starting to do deals. The first few deals have already been cut. And I think in order to safeguard that funding from any potential efforts to claw it back, there will be a flurry of activity in the next couple months.
All right, so they're trying to get the money out the door in a way to kind of demonstrate traction and progress, and showing that they are having a positive impact in communities in the economy. But how are they attracting partners? Because the Coalition for Green Capital, again, they're providing some of that $5 billion in federal funding, but they're also trying to attract additional funding and additional capital from other wealthy investors. So how is that going?
Yeah, I mean, under the bill and under the rules that the Environmental Protection Agency put out, the 27 billion total was supposed to mobilize 7 times that amount in private funding. And so each of the recipients, these coalitions that you mentioned, have their efforts to do that, and that is by underwriting deals that other investors can come into, or having co-investment with other investors, and so they're all busily doing that. As you mentioned, we had an interview with Reed Hundt. Folks may remember him way back from the Clinton administration as the chairman of the FCC. I think he actually went to high school with Al Gore, and he has been a champion of green banks for decades now, and at some level was the architect of some of this thinking around how to finance green banks around the country. And so the Coalition for Green Capital just did its first 2 deals totaling $175 million. One of them is to an outfit that will make loans to small businesses to do kind of commercial energy upgrades, energy efficiency upgrades. And then the other is to a lender to school districts that will help electrify some 1,300, I think, electric school buses across 7 different states. So those kinds of sort of umbrella deals that then catalyze additional lending, I think also, create demand, obviously, for like things like electric school buses. So this money was going to be kind of coursing through the system in the next few months, and I think will create a little bit of a buzz. We thought maybe it would have happened earlier, and that might have had some impact on people's perception of sort of the clean energy opportunities. But even post-election, I think people will start to see that the benefits of things like the Inflation Reduction Act actually do start to get down to their school, their community, their small business, as it were. And again, I think go a long way in kind of creating political support for some of these things. That's not just some kind of carbon reduction effort at the kind of global level, but it's actually getting a better school bus for your kid to get to school.
Yeah, and you noted that the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is supposed to mobilize a whole bunch more private capital than what the federal government is putting out to work. And I liked Reed Hundt's line in there about what the government calls mobilization. We just call other people's money, or OPM, which is a classic term in finance.
That's right. And there are, increasing numbers of opportunities for folks who have, kind of, money to lend or other capital to go in with the players in this GGRF funding and find kind of co-investment opportunities, in many cases with some of the risk taken out, by the in a kind of catalytic capital way by the lenders and by the original intermediaries of putting these deals together. So there's a whole new category of financing available now for impact investors to get involved with.
That's great. Well, you can read Amy Cortese's full Q&A with Reed Hundt on impactalpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes to this episode. But for now, let's take one more quick break. When we come back, how a mutual aid network in North Carolina is helping overlooked entrepreneurs rebuild after Hurricane Helene. Longtime impact investing champion Kevin Jones, who runs the Neighborhood Economics Conference with his wife Rosalie Hardin, had a guest piece in Impact Alpha this week about how his community of Asheville, North Carolina is rebuilding some 6 weeks after Hurricane Helene devastated the area. He writes about a return to the classic model of mutual aid to support entrepreneurs who have been overlooked in the rebuilding efforts. David, what is meant by mutual aid, and how is that being applied in Asheville?
Well, I think what's meant by it is, good old-fashioned, neighbors helping neighbors. And Kevin, as you said, started SOCAP way back, sold it a few years ago, has started this Neighborhood Economics Conference, which moves around to different cities, and it was scheduled to be in Asheville this month. Of course, they've had to delay it because much of that city is still without water and power, even so long after the storm. But they're going to mount it, I think, in the spring, and it's sort of a fascinating case study now, because Asheville is a hotbed of kinds of community finance and self-help and social entrepreneurship and other things. And so now all of that energy is being directed towards this rebuilding effort. And Kevin, actually, despite the hardships, I think the Swannanoa River ran through his house, for something like 6 hours and washed away a lot of their household. But on the other hand, it's like an opportunity to kind of build kind of community resilience out of disasters. And I think he thinks, at least at the outset, that the disasters brought out the best in folks as they work together, even folks who might not have had as much in common before the storm.
So what are the broader lessons that we can take from this that impact investors can use to think about their own models?
Well, one of the things he wrote about in his post in Impact Alpha this week was how there are gaps kind of in the in the relief efforts, and generally speaking, folks that have some kind of organized entity, it maybe even just a physical location that got damaged, a restaurant, for example, might be able to get aid and relief to rebuild, but that many of the folks in a slightly more informal part of the economy, like caterers versus restaurant owners, might not have a physical location and don't have a business association advocating for their needs. And so they've been making lots of efforts to kind of organize those kinds of folks. And so a caterers association to be able to get in view of some of the relief efforts. They have been working with the Eagle Market Streets Development Corporation to identify those kind of groups and get aid to them. There's a network of underrepresented entrepreneurs who can help restore business operations. Some of them might just be contractors and folks who can help in the rebuilding efforts, but who need to be themselves supported in their business efforts. So again, it's like things are bad there in Asheville, and I think we know some folks living there and still without water and things. So there's definitely hardship, but I think there's also kind of a excitement about putting in place some of these kinds of resilience measures that were necessary probably even before the storm and certainly necessary after the storm.
So, at Impact Alpha, we cover a range of topics, and impact investing kind of encompasses a range of approaches. So not just climate finance or sustainable finance, but also local finance. And I know we talk a lot about place-based investing. And so I think that this post really resonates with that theme that, in some ways, all investing can be local as well.
Absolutely, and again, as I said, neighborhood economics was kind of singing exactly that song that you just said, and now they have a chance to kind of put it into place. I think the neighborhood economics office, if I understand, was actually in Kevin and Rosalie's home and also got washed away. So they've put a plea out for some money to help rebuild the building, but they're also in the same fund, helping these underrepresented entrepreneurs get themselves back on their feet. So if folks want to know what's going on in Asheville, Kevin Jones is a good place to start.
Well, we certainly have Kevin Jones and his wife Rosalie Harden and all those impacted in Asheville in our thoughts, and hope that they get the resources they need so they can rebuild. You can read the full guest post by Kevin on impactalpha.com, and we also have a link in our show notes. But for now, that's going to do it for this week in Impact. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Brian.
What a week. Thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For more exclusive stories about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. If you like the show, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, and be sure to leave us a 5-star rating. It really helps other people discover the show. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh. We'll see you next week for more Impact.